I hit calm seas for a while, for a few years actually, with the occasional rocky moment, but it was nothing that actually really threatened to tip me over. Even though there were still aspects of my life that bothered me, I couldn't help feeling good about where I was. I had a good job, I had good friends, I had great connections with my family, and Sarah and I were even in a good place. Most importantly, though, my daughter and I, we were great. Jovi and I did so much together. We were always either going to the zoo or going to the movies or going to a museum to check out all the dinosaurs. And a couple of my favorite things that her and I did together was going to the Denver Pop Culture Con, or Comic Con, but in Denver. The first time her and I went together, we cosplayed as Logan and X-23, complete with claws and blood. Jovi in her X-23 costume, still one of my all-time favorite pictures of her. I got to teach her how to make s'mores that night, which was just, for something so simple, so awesome. And the second time we went, her and I, we dressed up as Drac and Mavis from Hotel Transylvania, which has always been one of our all-time favorite animated films. At one point, when she was young, we turned her bedroom into this giant fort. We were constantly playing around the house. Hide and seek, tag, just a couple of our favorites. We had the best kind of routine, which was simply having fun together. I cherished everything that Jovi and I did together, and the list, honestly, could just keep going. Every day we spent together, we just kept getting closer and closer. We ended up becoming regulars at this laser tag and arcade place. Jovi had gone there on a birthday party, or for a birthday party, and instantly just became a fan. And so at first, when we went, we just figured it'd be another fun thing. But we got hooked. We'd always go play 2 or 3 rounds of laser tag and then spend the rest of the time in the arcade. We'd be on the same team sometimes, and other times we would battle against each other. But after every round, we go to the scoreboard and see where on the rankings we would end up. Once our day at the arcade and laser tag would end, we always followed it up with smoothies. But that was the thing about Jovi and I. We had so many traditions. We had big traditions and we had very tiny ones. But the foundations of our bond were really reinforced with those. I'm a huge fan of traditions. I genuinely believe that every family needs to have them and they need to celebrate them. I loved starting traditions with Jovi, especially the big ones. I think my favorite tradition has always been the Christmas one that I started when Jovi was 2. I decided that my daughter, no matter what, would always have a white Christmas. So every Christmas Eve, or Christmas Eve, depending on which alternating year between Sarah and I make and I hang up snowflakes. Some of the snowflakes are actually things that Jovi and I watch together or enjoy together throughout the year. Generally just things that we're fans of. Every year is a new batch of snowflakes, and the fandom flakes, as I like to call them, are always new and always different. But I make sure that when Jovi wakes up that morning, she wakes up to our family snowfall. It's the longest running tradition that we have, and Jovi actually looks forward to it every year, and I love making them every year. It's a lot of work for a very short payoff, but it's worth it when I see Jovi smile. She knows the fandom flakes are there, and she always immediately looks for him. Sure, as she's getting older, she'll sometimes act like it's not a big deal to her, but when I see that smile, I know that she loves it. And all the time, and all the hand cramps are totally worth it. In September of 2013, a storm kind of stalled over the Front Range of Colorado. And as a result, rivers rose and rushed through numerous northern Colorado communities. It was one of the worst floods in the state's history. And among the areas destroyed in the flood's path was Vestine Smith Park. See, after the divorce, I had found myself stricken in grief to the point where it took a couple of years to even go back to Estes Park. It had been a place of connection for Sarah and I, and after we ended, I felt as though that connection was permanently lost. Granted, once I returned to Estes with my daughter, I found like an evolved connection to that beautiful, beautiful mountain town. And even though I was able to return to Estes after a little bit of time, I could not bring myself to return to Vestins. It was a place preserved in memories that I felt betrayed by. I knew that if I went back to it, I wouldn't be able to see it as the beautiful park that it was. But I always told myself that someday I would go see it again. I told myself that revisiting the park was the last piece of closure that I needed. But I couldn't bring myself to go. As much as I knew that I needed to, there was a part of me that simply did not want to. And I told myself that I had time. It took me a long time to get over Sarah. Truth be told, that I was still struggling with our split by the time the flood happened. And when I heard the news about the park, I instantly felt as though closure on my end of things was permanently lost. And then I couldn't help but laugh. I had made the decision not to give myself the closure that I needed, and then the rivers wiped the place away. Eventually, the water levels dropped back down, and the roads were reopened. It was safe to travel the canyons again, and the damage done became a part of the scenery. On the drive up the canyon, you can't help but pass the entrance to Vestine Smith. And the first drive up after the flood, I felt this knot inside of me when we passed the entrance to the park. It had caution tape stretched across it, and signs posted that it was closed. I felt like I was being told that the closure I told myself I needed was actively refused from me. I would have to find some other way. I didn't find one specific thing to help with it. Eventually, it just happened. After such a long time of trying to get over Sarah, I was able to. It was a welcome change of pace. Unfortunately, instead of being able to start rebuilding a life, finding new strengths, embracing a new level of confidence, I fell into this void of loneliness and zero self-esteem. It was exhausting. Before I knew where the time had gone, I found myself sitting at the dining room table in May of 2016, just feeling dread. I had been over Sarah for some time at that point, but realizing that what would have been our 10-year wedding anniversary was coming up, and it rejuvenated a lot of old feelings. It was like internal zombies crawling from the dirt inside of my heart and just tearing it apart as they dragged their rotted corpses out. I allowed those zombies to walk about and do their damage for a short time. And when I and then and then I decided to write. I couldn't help it. It felt like the right thing to do, and so I did it. When I sat down to write, it started out as this reflection on our relationship, and then I deleted it and started over. My fingers hit the keys, and 2 words came out instantly. Dear Sarah. I stared at those 2 words for a long time before I started typing again. It turned into this several-page eulogy, detailing everything that I had loved about her and our marriage, and everything that I hated about our marriage. I detailed everything and every feeling about the way it ended between us, and then I detailed how it would be the last time I was going to allow those feelings to have any breath. I was going to lay it all to rest. And I was going to bury it where it had all began. I made the decision that I was going to go back to Beeston Smith Park, and that's where I would speak my piece and get my closure. But I felt weak. I felt like I needed someone with me, not to share the moment with, but just to have some support. I didn't have to think about who I wanted to have with me. I sent Jake a text stating that I needed him with me on June 3rd. I needed him to drive me to the park, and I needed him to not really dive into any reasons. I just needed him there. He didn't question, and he didn't pry. He just said, "You got it." I went to work on June 3rd and treated the day as normally as I could. I knew that once the workday ended, I was going to go and give my eulogy. I felt nervous and just a little off that day. But I made it through, and the day ended, and I hightailed it to the spot that Jake and I were going to meet at. He pulled up next to me, and I got in his car. He clarified where we were going, and I told him. And on the way there, I explained what I was going to do and what the significance of the day was. He was cool with everything, just as I knew he would be. And we got to the park, and Jake parked the car at the entrance, and we both got out. He kept his distance and told me to take all the time that I needed. So I pulled the eulogy out of my pocket, and I walked to the entrance of the park. There were 2 gates, one on the east side of the park and one on the west side. And the sign for the park was this large stone engraving. And the park was still closed and taped off, and I had considered ignoring the tape altogether and making my way down into the ruins of what used to be one of the most beautiful parks in northern Colorado. But I stopped at the sign. Looking at it, I felt like I didn't need to go down into the park itself to do what I came to do. With the exception of the cars passing by, everything was quiet. It felt weird to break the silence with my voice, so I spoke softly. After I said what I wanted and stood there in silence for just a little bit, waiting to see if there were any other words that wanted to be said, I dug a hole just underneath the entrance sign. I laid the eulogy in it, and I buried it. I felt the same way that I had when I watched that judge sign the divorce papers. I didn't feel good. I didn't feel relief or freedom. I felt void. I stood up, questioning my decision, and then simply said goodbye. and I turned away from the park. As I walked back to Jake's car, a state trooper was walking towards us as well. He asked how we were doing and pointed out that the park was closed. And Jake and I both assured him that we knew and we weren't going into the park. Satisfied that we weren't trespassing into the park, he got back in his truck and he told us to have a nice night and left. I told Jake that I was ready to leave. We got in the car and we made our way back into town. And the further away from the park that we got, the better I felt. I could feel the mixed bag of emotions inside of me debating over which emotion would come out. And I thank Jake for being there and just being patient. He gave me reassurance and then told me that he kind of expected me to need more time. We had not been there for that long, even though it had felt like a very long time to me. I realized that for something I had put off and dragged out for so long, all I had really needed was a small window of time to speak my piece and say goodbye. But I got my closure. Jake and I decided after that to get some dinner, which I was in kind of a weird headspace for. I felt better about visiting the park, but I still felt a little off. I felt like I should have been excited and happy and instantly making this visible change, but I wasn't. Instead, I felt like I was at a crossroads, but every direction was closed for construction. I think Jake knew that I wasn't all there and that I was in need of some company. At some point during all of this, I can't really remember at what point Jake told me that Christy had predicted why I needed him to be with me. When I had originally asked him to drive me up to the park, he had mentioned it to her, and she had told him that it was probably something to do with the anniversary. We ate and we enjoyed our dinner and decided that instead of calling it a night right afterwards, we would go to a movie. So Jake let Christy know, and she told us that she would meet us at the theater. The three of us sat down to see the movie Pop Star, Never Stop Stopping. They say that laughter is the best medicine. And that night, that saying was truer than it had ever been for me. The catharsis of that day, the company, and the movie ended up being the exact combination that I desperately needed. By the time the movie was over, I felt amazing. I hugged Jake and Christy and I thanked them for the whole day, and I headed home. I didn't feel sadness. I didn't sense that crossroads. I just drove home, rocking out to music and smiling. And for a day that was intended to be about closure and grief, it turned out to be one of the best days for several years. "2019. That year, I could feel the ride that I was on starting to get bumpy. Or better yet, I could see those storm clouds starting to form and roll in. But I didn't pay any attention to it. And for a good portion of the year, I was well. And then the ride started to dip. I started feeling the familiar cold, poisonous touch of depression, kind of gently grazing its lifeless fingers around my mind. My anxiety started to spike, and I began feeling more on edge than I had been for years. I hated it, and it frustrated me which just started to trigger those familiar thoughts of, what is wrong with you? As those thoughts and those feelings were creeping back in, I was trying to brace myself for what came with them. I was scared, but I didn't want anyone to know that I was scared. History repeats itself, folks. Only this time, I didn't turn to alcohol to get me through it. I just put more energy into stuffing it all down and ignoring it. And every day I anticipated the shift, the drop. And every day it didn't happen. Eventually, I stopped anticipating it and just carried on. You see, when Sarah and I were married, during that first year of marriage, in fact, I got a tattoo for her. She had wanted a tattoo, but she hated needles and she didn't want to experience it. I wanted to get something that represented her, but I didn't want to get her name. So I ended up settling on getting the Jack Sparrow tattoo from the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. We were both huge fans of the trilogy. There were only 3 movies at that time. And Sarah loved that Sparrow tattoo. And when the second movie came out, we even dressed up as pirates and went to the midnight showing of it. But the tattoo, it also represented a life of freedom and beauty. And when I looked at Sarah, that was how I felt. So I got that tattoo for her right on the top of my right forearm for all the world to see. After we split, I told myself and her that I was going to keep the tattoo as a reminder of the good times that we had together. Sarah didn't care, but at that time I felt like it was important. I had that tattoo for a long time. I got asked about it everywhere I went, which kind of hindered me a little bit at first when I was trying to move on from Sarah. It became just something that was on my arm, and once I got over Sarah, it stopped being a reminder and was just something that I didn't care about anymore. The majority of my tattoos all have very deep meanings and themes that function as tools for me to use when I work on my mental health. I love tattoos. They are relaxing and incredibly cathartic. My tattoo artist, he knew me very well, and he knew a lot of my story. And he knew that when I sat or lay down on his table to get some ink, I would just let him work. Honestly, of all my tattoos, there are only a couple of spots on a couple of them that actually hurt and weren't relaxing. People tend to be shocked to hear that tattoo pain doesn't really affect me, but my artist would tell them that when you've been through some serious shit in your life and you get some tattoos, chances are you won't feel the pain as much. The last tattoo that I got, hopefully not the last, but the last one that I got in Colorado, was inspired by Godsmack. Their album, When Legends Rise, it was another win from that band for me. And the songs on that album had touched me like all of their other stuff. I had known that it was well past due for me to cover up that Sparrow tattoo. But I just couldn't figure out an image to cover it up with. And then one day, I was listening to that album and their song, Eye of the Storm. And it hit me. I just knew that I wanted the image of the silhouette of a man facing a hellstorm that was coming at him. The idea is that storms in life will always come with the goal of defeating us. And in those times, we need to take a stance and hold true to not giving in. The rock that my figure is standing on, it's made out of the Godsmack logo because their music has been such a massive part of my journey, and I have turned to their music every time that I have felt like I was losing at life. I told my artist what the idea was, and I told him that it was time to cover up the sparrow. He was stoked, and he told me that he had been waiting for years to cover it up. We set the appointment, and I remember looking at the stencil over the sparrow and just getting this rush of emotions. It felt so uplifting to know that soon I would never see that sparrow again. I watched my artist line, shade, and color over that sparrow, and bit by bit, the bird vanished. It felt like I was laying this massive piece of me to rest. Almost as if I were visiting the gravestone of my marriage for the first time and saying goodbye for the last time. I don't think my artist noticed, but I had a moment where the feeling of relief was overwhelming, and I almost let a few tears out. Instead, I wiped my eyes, I closed them, and I just let my mind clear out. I had no idea what was coming for me later in that year. Jovi and I, we got the opportunity to take a real vacation together, just us, to visit my brother and his family out in California. We were stoked. Not only would we get to see and spend time with the family, but it was just us, father and daughter, getting away from it all for just a little bit. I had visited my family a couple times prior to that vacation, and I always loved our time together, but California never really did it for me. And LA was always such a disappointment. You would think that for a globally known and celebrated city, the people in charge there would want to keep it clean and presentable. It's not on both accounts. During our vacation, though, I got to see some new things in California, and I had a new appreciation for it. My brother knew the good spots, and we spent a lot of time there. It was the first time in California that I felt like I actually noticed some of the beauty. That trip was a much needed sigh of relief. I had zero anxiety, zero stress. My mind was peaceful, and there simply weren't any negative thoughts. It was fantastic. Vacations are always too short, but I felt like I had actually cleared my head and that the vacation had done exactly what vacations are supposed to do. I felt rejuvenated and peaceful. Jovi and I flew back home, and we felt great. I had a couple of huge concerts lined up to go and enjoy, one of which was Godsmack in my hometown. And when I was buying my ticket to that show, my gut had pushed me to buy the upgraded ticket so that I could actually meet them and get a picture with them. Normally, I don't consider those kinds of upgrades, but I felt like it could potentially be the last time that I got to see them live, and so I bought that upgrade. And yes, I got my picture with them, and I had the chance to shake their hands and thank them for their impact on my life. I was elated, and halfway through their set, I was in tears because I just kept feeling such this profound emotional freedom. I felt like I was making these huge strides in keeping my mental health in a good place. I didn't feel ashamed or wrong for the events in my life. I had accepted that they were a part of me and that I could learn or help others through those scars. And then life decided to test me on how firm my stance against the storm was. I had the tattoo to serve as a tool for when the storms would come, and I was confident that I had a firm grip on the steering wheel of my life. I woke up one day, and the storm had arrived. Those calm seas of mine were gone. And at first, I did what I needed to, and I worked on processing why I was suddenly feeling so low. I focused on how I reacted to stuff and how I was combating it pretty well. But that storm was relentless, and it knew that all it had to do was wear me down. I knew that I was in trouble as soon as I questioned myself. I started to drift away from my friends, and I stopped talking as much when I was around my family. I started to resent people around me who were able to smile because suddenly, smiles weren't infectious for me. And before I realized what had happened, I put on that old familiar disguise, and I told myself the same old lies. The roller coaster that my dog had told me about wasn't just dropping on me, it was plummeting. And the farther it fell, the faster I fell. By the time November of that year rolled around, I was in complete and desperation mode. Sarah contacted me and asked me if I would like to have dinner with her and her husband. Jovi would be there too, as well as their newborn son. I was all for it because Jovi had always talked about how she wants us all to get along well enough that we can have dinners and hangouts as a full family. Plus, we all get along well, and I needed something that was a little bit of a change of pace. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and we went to Red Robin, a favorite of Jovi's back then. And the dinner was going fine. So I wanted to talk to you about something, Sarah said quietly and nervously. My stomach sank instantly. Her entire demeanor had suddenly changed, and I glanced at her husband, whose body language had also suddenly changed. Something was up, and chances were that I was not going to be a big fan of it. "What's up?" I asked. And then Sarah and her husband went into an entire sales pitch about the future and wanting to move out of Colorado. They were thinking of moving to Texas, somewhere in the Austin area. Sarah's husband started to work on the pitch of telling me that if they moved to Texas, then I could also move out of Colorado and maybe finally pursue my dreams of movies and writing. He asked me what places I wanted to live in, and I stupidly told him that Seattle had been a place of great importance to me. I was getting pissed because Jovi was the only future for me. Being a dad and maintaining my promise to her was what mattered to me. They told me that we could do the deal where Jovi would come home to me in the summers and spend the summers with me and then the school year with them. I told them I hated that. And then Sarah told me that they also thought that I could go with them. They had only suggested all the other things because Sarah's husband wasn't sure how I would feel about moving to Texas, where I had zero connections to anyone. Sarah assured me that the idea had no ill will. They didn't want to separate Jovi and I. My mind, it was a jumbled mess, and I had a hard time finding proper responses. I told them that I needed to think about it and that I would get back to them about it at some point in the near future. They agreed, and our dinner concluded. We said our goodbyes, and I drove home in silence and in tears. The music I had been listening to before the dinner suddenly sounded imposing, and I could not concentrate. I had to turn it off. I hated the idea of leaving, and I hated the idea of them wanting to leave. The irony being that I had been telling people for years that if it had not been for Jovi, I would have left Colorado as soon as the divorce was finalized. I didn't sleep that night because that size of change on top of my plummeting mental health, it was a lot to process, and I simply couldn't shut my mind off. The next day, I picked Jovi up for Thanksgiving. We were going to go and spend the day with one of my uncles and his family, and I was looking forward to it because I hadn't got to see those cousins of mine since Jovi was born. But I couldn't fully enjoy it because I knew that it was potentially the last Thanksgiving I would spend with my family. And I couldn't tell anyone about Texas. Jovi and I carpooled with my parents, and when we arrived and got out of the car, Jovi and I were walking next to each other. I leaned over really quick and I reminded her that she couldn't say anything about Texas. She understood, and we went inside to enjoy the day, which we did, even if it felt like there was this massive, lingering shadow everywhere that I looked. Following Thanksgiving, I lost my footing, and my disguise was cracking. I started having the thoughts again of just vanishing. I mean, I was a mess. I was at work one morning, and one of my favorite coworkers, a man who became kind of like a grandfather to me, he came over to me and he made one of his usual little quips. And it made me laugh, and I told him that I needed that. His smile left, and he sat down in front of me and just asked bluntly, "You're not okay, are you?" I couldn't lie to him, and I told him about Texas. I spared him details, but I told him that I hadn't been doing well for some time now, and the idea of Texas was just killing me. He gave me some much needed support and guidance, and then went back to work. His words helped me find a little bit of grounding, and they honestly got me through that day. One of my other coworkers, someone who great friend to me for many years, was opening up and venting just a little bit about what's going on in her world. And I made the comment of trying to deal with my own shit, and she told me that she could tell something was up, but she didn't know how to or if she should have approached me about it. So I told her about Texas. Eventually, there was about 5 people that I talked about Texas to, and they all promised not to say anything to anyone about it until I made a decision about it. But I was spiraling, and people were noticing. My disguise was no longer effective, which knowing that only made me feel worse. One day, I was approached by our HR rep and was taken to an office. We sat down, and I was informed that there had been some people who were concerned about me. Everyone, it turned out, had noticed a complete change in me, and it hadn't been a good one. One particular associate, one of the managers of a different department, had been the one to approach HR and ask them just to check in on me. I didn't open up all that much to her. All I said was that I was struggling and that I would be fine, and that I was trying to just process a potential massive change coming up in my life. But not long after that, things just boiled over. One of my team members and I, we got ourselves in a little bit of trouble, and it was the tipping point for me. I asked my manager if I could talk to him because I was completely breaking down. We went into one of the empty conference rooms, and I fell apart. I'm talking like complete sobbing mental breakdown. I told him everything. I told him about Texas, my fear of saying no, and believing that if I did say no, that Sarah and her husband would be so resentful at me that they would take Jovi away from me. I told him about my mental health, my thoughts, the fantasies about just vanishing. And then I told him that I had also been struggling with suicidal thoughts again. I said it all. Once the words started coming out, they weren't going to stop. We were in that conference room for a long time, and he just knew that I had been in desperate need of that release. He never gave the details to HR or anyone, but I was checked on multiple times a week following that breakdown. They were subtle checks, right? And I was quietly given the hotline number just in case those thoughts of mine started to sound a little too good. Even though getting everything out definitely helped me feel a little bit better, it didn't mean that I was out of the woods. It just meant that I had a couple of extra people to help give me some relevant encouragement. Christmas time came along, and I still hadn't talked about the idea of Texas. I hadn't made my decision on it yet because every time that I would start to really consider it and consider everything that would come with it, my anxiety would spike and I wouldn't be able to breathe. Once the attacks would finally subside, my mind would just shut down. I wouldn't talk and I could barely focus. So to avoid those attacks and those feelings, I couldn't bring myself to process Texas. But I knew that I needed to because Sarah and her husband were looking for an answer. They needed to know if they could start working on the move or working on a new plan to make life in Colorado work. Christmas came, and I spent the entire day fighting back tears. I knew in my gut that it was going to be the last Christmas in Colorado with Jovi, but I couldn't focus on that. We went to my mom and dad's place, and we finished Christmas over there, as we did every year. Despite me trying to not break down, it was a great day. We played games for the majority of the time, and we were at my parents' house. While we were at my parents' house, it felt right that potentially the last Christmas my parents would get to spend with their granddaughter should end with silliness and laughter. Christmas always goes by too quickly. And Jovi was picked up that night, and I left shortly afterwards. I drove home in silence once again as these tides of change just started crashing down on me. By the time I went to bed that night, I was physically and mentally exhausted. The final few days of the year were rough because I started to force myself to try and be responsible and think about Texas. I did it. Through many anxiety attacks, a new weight of depression, and it felt like those suicidal thoughts were in the corner just giving me those little head nods, letting me know that they were still there and available. I didn't celebrate New Year's Eve or day that year. Instead, I went to bed early, and I was able to fall asleep long before the ball dropped, and the worst year of anyone's life would begin. My new year began with suicidal thoughts. I woke up one morning and just felt that suicide and depression were my only companions. It was like I had one on each side of me, and they both had their arms around my shoulders. I felt like I was close to the same spot that I had been when I got myself help through therapy. And after a couple of days of that, I grabbed my phone and I messaged the panel. I was desperate, and I felt like I needed to open up to the ones who I felt closest to and safest with. Unfortunately, a couple of our friends were out of country on vacation. I told them that what I needed to talk about could wait. Not having everyone there felt like an opportunity to get out of opening up, and I tried to take it. I was embarrassed, and I didn't really have much of a fight left in me. Much of my life had been spent conforming to and being expected to adapt to others' needs and wants, giving up my own needs and wants for others. And this felt like a right fit for me. I fantasized about a scenario of us waiting too long to talk. I would bottle everything in, turn it into a passing joke later down the line, and my friends would be none the wiser that I had contemplated suicide daily after the new year. Jake and Christy contacted me outside of the panel as I was playing the scenario. All it said was, "Do you still need to talk even without everyone there?" And my mind was thinking, no, it's fine. It can wait. But my fingers typed, "I need to talk." And I hit send. A couple of nights later, I pulled in front of their house for dinner and discussion. I have never been so nervous in my life as I was at that moment when I was sitting in my car outside of their house. I debated driving away and canceling. But as hard as I tried to, I couldn't think of any excuse that would be convincing. I didn't know where I was going to start. And I was embarrassed because I had a fairly good life and was spending a good portion of it contemplating suicide. It didn't help either that when I pulled up that night, I knew Texas was a go. I knew that every time that year that I would spend with my friends was one of the last times we ever would. And that was a bit rough for me. I walked in and we gave our usual hugs and greetings while dinner cooked. And then my friend Christy, she looked directly at me and simply said, "Do you feel like you want to wait for the others, or can I ask what's going on?" I was going to wait, but once again, a part of me snuck in and hit that talk button. I started telling them everything. I was breaking down and crying, and as I spoke the words of suicide and told them about Texas and how I was feeling, I felt the burden of all of it start cracking, a little bit chipping away. They listened and they just let me talk. Jake asked me a few questions and I answered honestly. I was sitting at the table when Christy took a few steps towards me. She locked eyes on me. She can be a very intense person sometimes, and I needed that intensity. Christy spoke some truth to me that night that shook me. She didn't pull any punches, and as uncomfortable as it was to hear, I needed to hear it. And Jake interjected some wisdom and intensity as well. And suddenly, I felt like I could breathe just a little easier. By the time our two other friends showed up, my emotions were high, but in a good way. There had been some relief and a lot of pressure was gone. Dinner was ready and our other friends took their seats at the table, and as we ate, I spilled my guts again. I had been embarrassed when I pulled up to the house, and I was terrified of opening up to my friends. I feared their reactions, and due to my already corrupted mindset, I had almost convinced myself that they wouldn't be able to look at me the same after I spoke up. I was a dad. How could I even begin to consider ending my life? No good parent would do that. I had nonsense like that and their voices playing in my head. What I got was their actual voices and their actual reactions of support, comfort, and love. Christy flat out told me that I had already been through too much shit to let those thoughts take me now. And all four of them assured me that it showed more strength and courage to open about all of it than to try and battle it all on my own. I had also told them everything about Texas, including that I was going to give the okay and start trying to prepare for the move. I told them that my goal was to only have to stay behind for a couple of years before moving down to Texas as well. I didn't make the kind of money that Sarah and her husband did, and they had already been saving for over a year. I would have to stay behind just simply due to finances. I told them that I was scared of leaving, all of them, and that I was scared to having to essentially start over. They told me that what mattered was my daughter and I being together, and that they were going to make sure that I made it down to Texas to be with her. The intensity of the night subsided once all of the words were out. We finished eating and ended that night with laughter. That night depleted me of a lot of negativity, and even though I knew the road ahead was going to be some of the most difficult I would ever travel on, I didn't feel as much dread. A few days later, I asked Sarah and her husband to meet me at a coffee shop because I was ready to give them my answer. They had been patient, and Sarah had only texted me a few times about it beforehand, and it was time to talk about it. I was decently honest with them. I told them that my initial gut response was no, but their sales pitch had been done well. I couldn't argue with the rising cost of living in Colorado that was getting out of control. I couldn't argue that Texas had better ranked schools than Colorado for Jovi, and I couldn't deny that a fresh, clean slate of life would be nice. I also told them that I felt like I couldn't say no because I feared that if I did, all of the hard work of co-parenting that Sarah and I had done over the years would go to waste and that they would try to take Jovi away from me. Neither of them responded to that, and I didn't expect them to. Sarah's husband asked me why I wanted to say no, and I told him that starting a whole new life in a place I had never seen or even cared to see was scary because I was going to have to leave and say goodbye to everything and everyone that I had known and had mattered to me for over 30 years. I told him that it would be difficult to do so when the time came. I don't think either of them really understood that because they are just wired differently. They have that amazing ability to just not feel like they have to be connected to the world of people. They love their families, but they are able to be away from them without feeling separation. There are times where I definitely envy them for that ability, because it would make life just so much easier. I'm not wired that way. I'm a walking contradiction of feeling the need to be connected to people and the world while also spending the majority of my life hiding from it. The decision was made, and they pounced on those preparations. They had been ready for it even before they had asked me. They had a timetable now, and now that I had agreed, they could work towards it. They left that day ecstatic for the future, and I left feeling like I was being forced to lay an entire life, the good and the bad, to rest. I felt like the whole year was going to feel like a never-ending funeral. But now that moving to Texas was a go, it was time to start telling everyone. First up were my folks. And telling them was one of the worst days of that year for me. It made me feel like I had always been their screw-up kid, their constant source of stress and disappointment, and now I was going to have to break their hearts by telling them that not only was their youngest son moving away, but their granddaughter was going to be gone as well. They took the news fairly well. They were kind of quiet about it at first, but then they looked at me and flat out said, "Well, you can't be away from Jovi, so you need to do what needs to be done to make sure you aren't separated longer than what's necessary." I was relieved that they took it as well as they did while I was there. I'm positive, though, that as soon as I was gone, there were some choice words and emotions that were expelled. But they were and continue to be incredibly supportive. My dad told me that day that it followed in line with our family. My parents had moved from their hometown to start a new life. My brother had done the same thing, and now it was my turn. They also felt that as much as it would suck to not see Jovi and I, they knew that I needed to get out of Colorado for a time. Had it not been for Jovi, I would have left as soon as Sarah and I had split. There was a lot of pain associated with Colorado, and my parents knew that I needed a fresh start. I needed to be in a place that didn't have a long and difficult personal history for me. I told everyone and let them know that my time in Colorado, or time at work and in Colorado, was limited and officially ending. I would still be around through the rest of the year and maybe even the year afterwards, but I was on a countdown now. Everyone reacted the same way. They were all bummed, but understood and respected that my daughter was my priority and that I was sticking to my promise to be a part of her life no matter what, even if it meant leaving everything behind and following her to this new place. Less than 2 months later, the world was falling apart. I was supposed to pick Jovi up for our weekend, but Sarah and I decided that with everything going on in the world, maybe we would hold off for a weekend. Work became stressful because of the events, and we were all expected to adapt to the new rules, the regulations, and processes that were being issued by the government to businesses. Everyone secluded themselves in their homes unless you had to go out. That one missed weekend would turn into 4 months without my daughter. My department at work was swamped, and people were on edge. I changed my schedule to give a little ease to some of the people that I worked directly next to, and to give myself something to do during the night that would occupy my mind. The most contact that I had with Jovi was a Zoom call on the weekends. I kept telling myself that it would all pass soon enough and I would get to be with Jovi again, but I was afraid that Sarah and her husband would stick to the move regardless of whether I got to spend time with Jovi or not. I don't know why exactly. It was just something I decided to do. But I made a choice to not shave or get my hair cut until I was reunited with Jovi. I didn't care if that meant that I rocked the crazy long hair and scraggly beard until I was in Texas. For whatever reason, I just decided that growing my hair out was something I was going to do. And coming off of a year where I was at such a low point, being forced to be separated from my daughter did not help. Every time I would try to vent my frustrations or try to get anyone to understand how heartbreaking it was for me, they would just give me the bullshit answers that we were being force-fed during that time. I would try to talk to Sarah about it, but it never did any good because nothing I said or did, less than quitting my job and never seeing the outside world, mattered. I wasn't going to get to be with Jovi until things felt safer. I couldn't quit and I couldn't work from home, so I just worked as much as I possibly could. Working became a tool for me. It occupied my mind and it kept me busy. I know that I had a handful of people worried that I was working too much, but it was all that I could do to maintain control of my mental health during that time. The days that I didn't work were rough for me. I couldn't go to the movies, I couldn't spend time with my friends, and I felt trapped and stifled at home. I managed to get through them, but they were not easy. On one particular weekend, though, during kind of a really rough day, I heard a knock at the front door. And when I opened the door, I was stunned to see Jovi and Sarah across the yard. Sarah was in her car, and Jovi was standing outside of it. She had placed a card and a cookie on my front step. My initial reaction would have been to run over and hug my child, but during that time, you couldn't have contact with anyone. According to the media, if you did, you would die, and you would kill several people as well. So I fought the urge to hug Jovi. We spoke for the briefest of time. A quick, "It's so awesome to see you, and I miss you, Dad, and I hope you like the cookie." And then she got back in her mom's car, and they drove off. It was brief. I wish it had been a better moment, a longer moment, but it helped me get through the rest of that weekend. It gave me just a teaser of hope. And the cookie was pretty delicious. I've always been the guy who goes to the theater every weekend, or at least as often as I can. Movies have played a major role in my life, and they are my favorite form of storytelling. I connect through the world, or connect to the world, through movies. And they have been tools of inspiration, change, hope, etc., for me, for the majority of my life. The last movie that I got to see in the theater before the world shut down was a movie starring Ben Affleck. It's called The Way Back, and the majority of the marketing for the film promoted it as a basketball movie. It looked like a normal, down on his luck guy gets the opportunity to coach a youth basketball team, and he's able to turn his life around because of it. It's that kind of movie. But I'm a fan of Mr. Affleck's, and I was going to see it regardless of what it was, or if that was the case or not. It's not just a basketball movie, and it's not just a typical turn your life around kind of story. When I went and saw that movie, it hit deep and it triggered a lot in me. The movie felt personal, and by the time it ended, I was just stunned. It was basically 2 hours of therapy for me. Obviously, I'm not a basketball coach, player, and I'm not dependent on alcohol. But the movie reminded me of how easily I had let myself slip into that dependency so many times before. And it gave me a new tool, an updated tool, I should say, to use in the upkeep of my mental health. I'm not the kind of person who gives into superstition, fate, whatever. But the timing of that movie and the world shutting down a couple of weeks later is a fun little coincidence. I needed that movie. I didn't realize it until it got released to own and I rewatched it, but I needed that movie. I latched onto it and the primary lesson of the whole story. That movie, much like music and many other movies, has been crucial tools for me over the last couple of years. I had to adapt to the lessons of the movie, or I had to adapt the lessons of the movie to my life to fit my own perspectives. I didn't have to mentally alter much, just a little piece of lingo. The movie speaks heavily about focusing on the little things. You do several little things, fundamental things, correctly, and soon they add up. Don't focus on one big play, the one big move. Focus on the play at hand. The way I adapted it to fit my own was instead of basketball lingo, I used football lingo. That movie gave me what is basically my life's mantra at this point. One first down at a time. Every time that I watch that movie, I feel a massive wave of gratitude. To some, the movie won't hit like it did me, but that's okay. It struck me, and it continues to do so whenever I watch it. If I ever had the chance or get the chance to, I would love the opportunity to thank Ben Affleck for that movie because it helped keep me grounded, and it helped save my life. There came a moment when I had a heart-to-heart with myself. It was a lot like the moment in the courthouse bathroom where I told myself that July was quickly approaching and Jovi would be moving away. Sarah and her husband had already decided not to postpone the move. They had already signed paperwork and had jobs waiting for them. There was no stopping it. I needed to be prepared for it, and I needed to prepare myself for the very real possibility that I wouldn't be able to spend any time with Jovi before she left. I definitely wouldn't get to hug her again before she was gone. And I knew that I needed something to get me through it. And I needed something healthier than just consuming myself with work. So during my heart-to-heart, I told myself that without something positive to focus on, especially after she was gone, I wouldn't make it. It was as simple as that. The panel had pretty much disbanded at this point. We did the virtual game night here and there, but all real conversation just seemed to fade away. I felt a massive disconnection with the majority of the group. I don't think it was ever anything on purpose. I just think that sadly, our group just became another example of how hard it is to maintain close friendships with people in your 30s. It also didn't help that everyone's opinions about how the world was managing the pandemic varied. Politics and opinions definitely served as wedges to all of our friendships. It was a shame because that group was awesome. At one point during our time together as the panel, we had all talked about and tried producing a podcast. But we could never settle down on a theme for the show, and it really felt like only a couple of us were actually into it. But during the pandemic, on those nights on my own at work, I would crank up the music and relax to some podcasts. Those nights where it was just me, the music, podcasts, and work were crazy productive. But it kept stirring a creative push in me, and I started making these little videos about bands that had made an impact on my life. The goal was to make it into a full-fledged show, and I was working towards it. When I wasn't at work, I was working on my little music show. But my creative push, it kind of started to push me towards something different. So Jake and I were talking about movies and how we miss going to the movies and then just chatting about them afterwards. It was something we always did. We would get out of a movie and either grab some food and talk about the movie or just stand in the parking lot chatting. It was something I had always done with my friends from high school up to the pandemic, or from high school up to the pandemic. And I missed the hell out of it. There wasn't a profound moment when lightning struck. I was editing an episode while watching the movie High Fidelity. Jake and Christy popped into my head, and I had a quick thought about all the times that we would just talk for hours about movies. And I had the fun thought pass through my mind. What if the three of you did a podcast about movies? That was all I needed. I texted them and I told them that I had an idea and if they would be interested in doing it with me. They didn't care what it was. They gave me a unanimous yes. So we broke the rules and we got together in person and I told them my idea. They were completely on board and the creative process began instantly. We ironed out what theme we wanted or how we were going to present it. We made Christy our producer and Jake and I would be the hosts. We just needed to figure out a name for the show and then we could get to work on the first episode. Christy made a comment to go and talk about our movie boners. And we lost it. We did tweak it a little bit. We added a flare of cheesiness and replaced the S with a Z and officially named our show Movie Bonerz. I went home that day just thrilled to create something with those two. I'd be lying, though, if I said that there wasn't just the smidge of fear that it would all fall through the cracks. But something felt different about this idea, and it felt like it had a little strength behind it. We had decided on what our first episode was going to be, and when I got home, I got right to work. I was excited, and I couldn't stop smiling. Getting to work on that first episode made me chuckle because the primary work that had to be done for it was just watching movies. All of the research part, at least for me, would come after the movie. Things in the world seemed to be easing up just a little bit. More people were going out to shop and picnic, whatever, just getting out of their houses in general. It eased up enough that Sarah agreed to keep up a long-standing tradition of celebrating Jovi's first and last day of school. Her last school year in Colorado ended, and we kept the tradition going. It was a little different because we couldn't go out, so we ate dinner on their patio, and I had to sit across from them to not make any contact. I also had to hop over the partition that closed off the patio, but I didn't care about the little differences. I just cared that I got to see Jovi. I got to see her smile. And it was great because I still wasn't cutting my hair or shaving at that point. I didn't get to hug her yet, so the crazy hair remained. Thanks to the podcast, even before we released it, I was able to find a sliver of peace. I was able to focus on the episode preps, and it gave me something to look forward to every week. I got to see my closest friends every week, and every week for the time that I was with them, I felt good, which was something I had not been able to say up to that point. And then something incredible happened. I got a text from Sarah a couple of weeks after Jovi's last day of school. She asked if I wanted to spend some time with Jovi. It would just be the two of us, and we could spend time together for a few hours. I was elated. I double-checked what she was saying, and she told me that Jovi and I needed time together before they moved and that everyone was completely comfortable with it. I was going to see her that weekend, which meant it was time to get cleaned up. I shaved that night, and I got my hair all chopped off the next day. My schedule at work was going back to normal, and I was going to be returning to the day shift. I was stoked to show up all cleaned up. When I came in, people immediately took notice. I had a few come up and say, "Does this mean?" To which I nodded yes, because I was trying to fight back my excited tears. My team, my coworkers, were and still remain some of the most supportive and encouraging group of people I've ever had the privilege of knowing. Everyone wanted to share a little bit of the excitement with me because everyone had an idea of how difficult it had been for me to be separated. It was an emotional boost that gave me another sliver of peace and hope. I was so nervous driving to see Jovi. I was scared that Sarah would text me or call me and tell me that they had all gotten sick or changed their minds. I had the worst case of butterflies in my stomach, and during that 30-minute drive, I was antsy as hell in the car. I pulled up to Sarah's place, and I let her know that I was there. I stood outside and waited in disbelief that it was actually happening. I saw Jovi come out, and that hug was intense. A flood of relief and hope and joy just crashed down on me all at once, and it was as if all of the colors in the world just became more vibrant. We had a picnic, and we just hung out that day. It was incredible. I couldn't believe that she was in the car with me. I was having a conversation with her. I could hug her and laugh with her. If I believed in spirits, mine would have been able to soar that day. We enjoyed 6 Saturdays and 1 Sunday together before they moved. We made sure to spend those few days together laughing and enjoying ourselves as much as possible. Places were opening up again, but there was still a lot that we couldn't do. but we worked with what we had and we made it work. I loved every moment of every one of those days. Our final 2 days together, we spent going on a kind of greatest hits tour of all of our favorite places. We spent time in Estes Park, primarily at the Stanley Hotel, which was always a favorite of ours. Before the pandemic, whenever we went to Estes, we always made sure to go and chill for a little bit on the grounds of the Stanley because it's just so beautiful. The view of the town and the mountain range from the front deck is just incredible. We made a day of going to all the places that had served just a little slice to our bond. With the exception of a few places, we were able to make it to almost all of our spots. The one that really bummed me out, though, was not being able to see a movie one more time with Jovi. She and I had been going to the theater together since she was like 3 years old, and I took her to see Wreck-It Ralph. Ever since that movie, we went almost every weekend we had together. Going to the theater together was always a big deal for me, and I know that she enjoyed it as well. So instead of going to a movie, we went to the theater that we had always gone to, and we just ate lunch in their parking lot. We had our favorite sandwiches, and then we took a few pictures together. Being outside of that theater was very bittersweet for me, and it would stick with me for quite some time. For me, that little tour that we did marked the ending of so many traditions that Jovi and I had together. And once our day ended, that would be it for those traditions. This was a new piece of parenthood for me to learn about, and I didn't do it so well. It didn't really hit me, though, until Jovi was actually on her way to Texas. And when it did, I struggled. On our last day together, we went to my parents' place so they could see Jovi one more time before the move. Jovi surprised them by not only showing up, but being comfortable enough to give them hugs. We spent the afternoon at their place where the little bit of time that we spent was just laughing and being in the moment as a family. We played games, we ate, and we laughed. It was beautiful, and truly the best way to end Jovi's time in Colorado with my side of the family. When I drove Jovi to her mom's, I ended up sticking around to help Sarah with a few of the last little cleanups in their place. It required a lot of throwing the heavier items away, but I was trying to soak up every last second that I could with Jovi. Even though I knew that I would be with her again, I wasn't positive on the timeline, and I knew that the darker parts of my mental health were just itching to pounce when I was most vulnerable. The time came, and I hugged Sarah goodbye. I told her to take care of our daughter and to take care of herself. And then I hugged Jovi. I had managed to not cry in front of her for the last 2 days that we were together, but saying goodbye broke me. All I could say was that I was sorry. I had tried to be strong and not break down in front of her, but I couldn't contain it. I told Jovi that I loved her and that we would be together again. I told her to enjoy herself in Texas and to not give her mom and her stepdad a hard time. I got in my car and I watched Sarah and Jovi wave goodbye. They turned away and they went back inside, and I drove away. A very strange thing happened to me as soon as I drove away from Jovi. The world, it turned gray. There was no more color in my eyes. I couldn't listen to music. I couldn't listen to any podcasts. Nothing felt right. Nothing sounded right. The world turned bleak. And I remember asking myself, is this what being a ghost feels like? Because that's how I felt. I was officially a ghost, stuck in a colorless world. And those dark entities in my mind, they ate it up. They wasted no time in pouncing on and berating me. The only fight that I had in me was the end goal of getting my ass to Texas and to be with Jovi once again. But it is difficult to conquer a journey when you start out defeated. I was quiet for the first week after Jovi left. I wish I could say that it was because I was processing or focused on what I needed to do, but I can't. I was quiet because I felt dead. Nothing felt right, down to just waking up. I couldn't process that Jovi was gone, and I couldn't process a life without her, temporary or not. I had endured a broken heart before, but this was on a whole nother level. I was broken, and this time there was no mending it. Or so I told myself. But I had a few people around me who knew that I was in a bad place, and they made sure that I wasn't going to lose sight of what was important. I had to get to Texas. I had to be with my daughter again. After my week of feeling dead, it was time to put my head down and focus on the task at hand. I spent a lot of my time working on that task with just work. I put in some insane hours at my job to the point where my boss told me that I had to at least stop coming in on Saturdays for a little bit. I needed a break from work. But I was trying to earn and save as much money as I could. I had set a goal, and I aimed to make it. Every day spent away from Jovi was more time that I remained a ghost in her past. That first month turned out to not be as rough as that first week. I was a robot, just going through the motions and doing what needed to be done. My mental health didn't have a chance to interfere because I was on autopilot. But then it hit. The world remained gray, and I was lost in it. Jovi and I would Zoom or talk once or twice a week, and I adored those times for the most part. But it was obvious that there was a major distance between us. We struggled to have conversations, and I felt increasingly irrelevant as time went on. I felt as though Jovi stopped caring about me altogether. She stopped caring about talking to me. I was an obligation, a distant burden on her. And that feeling of being a ghost never felt so real to me, or never felt more real to me than it did once I realized just how vast the distance between us had become. Even though nearly every conversation I had with Jovi felt like the distance was growing, I told myself that at least I got to see her face and hear her voice. There were countless dads out there who would probably be great at the job, but they don't get to hear their children's voices. They don't get to see their children's faces. I tried to give myself a little perspective, but at the same time, I was shortchanging myself. It is a thin line to walk when you add perspective to include others and tell yourself that your problems aren't as bad as others. It is extremely easy to fall onto the side of dismissal and judgment. and I fell. I began telling myself that nothing that I felt mattered. I told myself that I was weak, and I berated myself for even feeling sad about anything. How dare I let myself be negatively affected by the situation? I told myself that a real man, a real dad, would stand tall and conquer this challenge with no problem. I ripped into my heart and mind for not being determined enough. I got malicious towards myself, and the result was that I convinced myself that I wasn't even worth the feeling of being a ghost. I wasn't worthy of anything. I convinced myself that I wasn't worth the encouraging words from those closest to me. So, and so to avoid it all, I made a new disguise. I made a more realistic one that could move through the day without drawing too much attention. I don't think it was as effective as I thought, much like all of my other disguises. I know that it did not fool Sarah. There was one specific phone call with Jovi that things just blew up. Jovi and I got into yet another argument, which internally killed me because our phone calls shouldn't have been spent arguing. They should have been spent with better things. They should have meant something more. They should have been positive. But on this particular one, the argument just kept getting worse, and it boiled over when Jovi called me by my actual name and did not call me Dad. And that was it for me. I yelled at her out of anger, but internally, I told myself that I was done. Or so I believed. I had actually blurted out that I wanted my existence to be over. Life had officially lost its meaning to me. My own child no longer considered me her dad, and now she had heard those words come out of my mouth. Sarah got on the phone and took on the role of the mediator for Jovi and I, and then Sarah and I had a little chat. I don't remember what I actually said, but Sarah flat out asked if she needed to call someone or if she needed to talk to my parents to make sure that I was safe. What I said sparked something in her that she knew I was in about as low of a place as I possibly could be. I remember wanting to hate her. I wanted to hate her husband. I wanted to give in to the most pure and unchangeable kind of hate there is. Resentment wasn't good enough. Anger didn't fuel the fires enough. I needed hate. I was able to hate their decisions, hate the situation that they had created to which I was just expected to adhere to. I hated that I ever let myself fall for her. I hated that I ever met her. I hated so much of the little things about Sarah and her husband, but I couldn't actually hate them. I told Sarah that I hated what they had chosen to do. And she reminded me that I had agreed to it and that soon I would be in Texas and my clean slate could start. She calmed me down and I got off the phone. I half expected my mom to be on the phone with Sarah or to get a text from Jake and Christy, but it didn't happen. I hated everything at that moment, but I couldn't hate them. During the time without Jovi, the majority of my days were spent fighting the urge to end it all. Suicidal thoughts came back with a vengeance during that time, and it did get to the point where I did call the hotline. I was a desolate being, holding on to a dream scenario of holding on to life again. People would ask how I was doing, whether it was friends or family or the associates at grocery stores, just trying to make small talk and be polite. And I started responding the same way every time. I'm here. And that response started out as a spoken resentment. I didn't feel like I deserved to be breathing at all. But the more I spoke it, the more it shifted from resentment to a statement of self-encouragement. I'm here. Jake, Christy, my family, close friends, and my team at work all contributed to that shift. If it hadn't been for them, I probably would have ended my life that year. It's that simple. The more that they interfered with my dark thoughts, the more I felt like I wasn't in the fight for my life on my own. It's kind of like that moment in The Return of the King where Sam tells Frodo on the side of Mount Doom, I may not be able to carry it, but I can carry you. All of those people around me were Sam. They saved my life. I'm here. Shifted from resentment to self-encouragement. And then it became my spoken defiance against those dark passengers of mine. Speaking those two words gave me what I felt like I had given up on: purpose. It wasn't like my life was about to be completely turned around, but I could feel the change. No change comes with smooth roads, and I still had my off nights. One of which happened shortly after I started feeling that change was finally happening, because of course I was going to have a little bit of doubt. But in that doubt, I remembered that movie and the message from it. I heard Ben Affleck's character talking about not worrying about making the big play. Focus on those little things. Execute them correctly, and they will add up. Focus on the play at hand. As I thought about it, replayed it in my mind, it was remolded to be a little more relatable to me personally. And I put it in those football terms. My mind did something that it hadn't really done before. It simplified something for me. One first down at a time. You ever have one of those moments where your mind and your heart settles on something and you feel like you can actually face the world? This was that moment for me. I felt a charge. I felt called to action. I had two of the strongest affirmations I had ever had. I've been a holiday fan for years. I love the holiday season. From Halloween to New Year's, that's my favorite time of year. But that year, I had no drive to celebrate them. Jovi was gone. No one was going to visit. My roommate couldn't have cared less about the holidays, so I couldn't really share them with him. The holidays just had no meaning for me that year. My parents knew that the holidays were going to be a bit odd and probably rough for me, especially Christmas. They knew that I wasn't really celebrating it, but they weren't going to let me be alone on that day. And they certainly weren't going to let me not celebrate it just a little bit. Christmas time is important. And my parents knew that even though I didn't feel up to enjoying it, I still needed it. So I went over to their house and we had a very quiet and very calm Christmas. It was our last one. We all knew it. And it turned out to be one of the best moments of the year for me. Nothing grand happened, but just being with them during a tough time brought me so much peace. Despite knowing that I wouldn't have another Christmas with them for quite some time, it was meaningful. And it was just another example of how incredible my parents are and always have been. Something else happened around that time as well. I hit my financial goal to be able to make that move. And the final pieces of my preparations for Texas were put in place. And the first week into the new year, I gave my 2-month notice. Come March of 2021, I would be leaving the only life and place I had ever known.